Architecture is becoming increasingly difficult at this time. This is a painting from the early 19th century, but it pretty much sums up the conundrum that architects are finding themselves in the later half of the 18th century. And that is, wow, there's a lot of stuff out there. And how do you choose? This painting is actually in the Toledo Museum of Art, called The Architect's Dream. And it represents the architect over here, sitting on top of a column capital. He's surveying the possibilities. He's surveying the things that haunt him. Is this a dream or is this a nightmare? And you can see how landscape and qualities of light become tightly associated with styles of architecture. Here in the dark, forested, irregular terrain of this hill, we see Gothic architecture, the towers of which seem to be quoted by the pointy pine trees that surround it. Over here, on the flat land, bathed in clear, illuminating light, we have classical architecture. And looming behind that, in a kind of giant, scary way, we have Egyptian architecture. So how do you choose? And this moment really becomes the conundrum that architects are in for the next 200 years, let's say, or the architects are still in now. There is no longer an automatic style that is expressive of the ambitions of the age. You could look at Rococo and say, yeah, it's Rococo, that's what people do now. But with the Enlightenment comes in this recognition that people are not part of nature, but apart from nature, and looking back at nature, and also looking back at history, and therefore having to make these choices about which history they embrace. Crisis of style is an issue that we've already begun talking about really for the last few lectures. The kind of architecture we talked about at the beginning of this class seemed to proceed directly and inevitably from conditions of the culture and from conventions of architecture that had immediately preceded it. When we move into the 18th century, there's a kind of rupture. It could be the kind of paradigm shift that Thomas Kuhn talks about, or it could be this change in episteme that Michel Foucault talks about, issues that we discussed in earlier lectures. But suddenly, there's a whole range of choice that architects have to make. And they make that choice with the aim of finding some way to make their architectural decisions mean something. You know, why choose one thing instead of another thing? How do you decide? How can you make your architectural choice not completely whimsical or arbitrary, but significant and important? That's what the big problem in the 18th century is. And we see here this painting by Thomas Cole, The Architect's Dream, of the sublime representation of the vastness of scale of architecture and the vast sweep of history, as tiny little midget architect sits on top of a gigantic column capital with his flimsy little pieces of paper holding his plans, looking at the choices in front of him. The choices aren't just historical, classical, Gothic, Egyptian, but they're also locked into mood and atmosphere. They're also locked into landscape. And how does an architect react? Over here we have a kind of straightforward embrace of history because it's classicism. And this is John Wood the Elder at the Royal Circus in Bath. Strictly speaking, John Wood the Elder and his son, John Wood the Younger, are continuing with Neo-Palladian architecture, and they're not really wandering off into great historicist excesses, which we'll see later on today. However, they take the Neo-Palladian style in an interesting direction, and that is, they apply it to the definition not simply of individual buildings, but of urban fabric. This seems to follow naturally from developments that were going on elsewhere in Europe, specifically in France, with the great urban squares like Place Vendôme, for example, where the idea was to define a decorous urban edge and to sell that off as a kind of speculative real estate adventure and to allow individuals to build the houses behind them. Bath is an interesting town, and a town whose economy lent itself well to this kind of speculation. Already in 44 AD, the town was established as a bathing establishment by the Romans. It had natural hot springs, hence natural baths. This is the Roman bath in the city of Bath. And the history might even go farther back than that. The legendary founder of Bath is King Bladud, who apparently was exiled from town because he had leprosy. And while wandering around herding his pigs on the outskirts of town, he discovered that the pigs were rolling in the mud. And then he too rolled in the mud, and mysteriously the leprosy went away. So the curative value of the waters in Bath go back a long way. And Bath, by the 18th century, was doing quite a booming tourist trade. Hence the desire to restructure the city. And to the woods, first John the Elder, then John the Younger, this task fell. I've decorated in green a couple of these interventions. Here's a square, here's the Royal Circus, and here's the Royal Crescent. Particularly of interest are the circus and the crescent, the former by John Wood the Elder and the latter by John Wood the Younger. These are all facade projects. Well, let's say site planning and facade projects. Each client got an individual architect to decorate the back. And you can see the strong figurality of these spaces, and you can also see something that really distinguishes the couple of decades between John Wood the Elder's intervention and John Wood the Younger's intervention. John Wood the Elder is making a closed space. It is all about defining the urban space. It makes nice Baroque connections to other elements within the city, but it really does keep nature out, or the only nature that is allowed to participate in the space is a copse of trees centered in the circular space. We come over to the intervention by John Wood the Younger, the Crescent. Very different attitude. We have here an open edge. We have an open engagement with nature. And in fact, the field here, called Barton Field, had a covenant on it that it was to perpetually remain unbuilt upon. And indeed, you couldn't even plant things there that would be higher than 8 feet, because they wanted to perpetually preserve views toward the Avon River, which runs down through here. And up here on top of the hill, we see another intervention by John Wood the Young called Lansdowne Crescent. Let me just say a few words about John Wood the Elder, because you look at him and you think, this guy is Neo-Palladian. Therefore, this guy is rational. This guy is systematic. This guy likes methodology. This guy is modern. And maybe this is part of being modern. John Wood the Elder undertook a project to measure Stonehenge. And this is completely consistent with 18th century archaeological interest in things like the ruins of Rome or the ruins of Greece. And in measuring Stonehenge, he became very, very interested in this ancient culture, this pre-Roman culture of the city of Bath. Very interested in the Druids, for example, and of course, insofar as he was directly working with Stonehenge, very interested in Stonehenge. There are some interesting things to be said about the geometry of Stonehenge and the geometry of the Royal Circus. For one thing, the diameter of the Royal Circus is about 318 feet, which is the diameter of the Stonehenge, at least the Stonehenge as measured by John Wood the Elder. And notice how here we have an outer ring. This is an annular elevated ring surrounded by a ditch, and an inner ring of the stones proper that we see down here. So too does Wood decide to plant a circle of trees, forming more or less the footprint of the actual stones of Stonehenge, and allowing the buildings to splay out to define the limits of the annular ridge. So there's a lot of weird masonry going on here. And in fact, Wood, like many of the architects of the time, was involved in the Masons, and he's not so covert about it. There are all kinds of Masonic symbols decorating the cornice of this very nice, Dorically articulated wall around the circus. Circus means round thing. It doesn't mean place for clowns and dancing elephants. By the way, this is what it looked like before they cleaned the facades. This photograph is probably from like 1982, and now the facades are cleaned. Most of England used to look like this because they burnt coal. The air was awful, and England looks quite different when you go back after they've cleaned the facade. I think this is interesting. I found this in a real estate advertisement for 8 the Circus. The rent would have been £5,500 per month, but I think it's interesting just to see how these houses get laid out. Of course, houses will vary in width based on how much facade was purchased by the owner. This guy seems to have about 3 windows worth of width, which seems like a good amount. It's enough space to give you an entryway in, and notice here there's a little sunken area around here to bring light into the basement, so that goods could be delivered directly into the servant quarters without going through the property. So there's a little courtyard down that you walk over, and at the basement level you have little storage rooms. This is the little entry into the house, servant rooms down here. And then a quite straightforward unfolding of major rooms, one facing the square and the other facing the back garden. The same strategy of development took place for the Crescent. Jane Austen, by the way, in North Ranger Abbey, and also in some of her other books, talks about visiting Bath. It was the thing to do among well-heeled people in the late 18th century, early 19th century. Architecture is simply an edge, and the opposite edge of that is nature. It opens up to embrace this great meadow pulling forward in front of it. Architecture no longer pulls itself away and delimits itself from the natural condition, but it completes itself through this embrace of the natural condition. And that's even a stronger statement up here with Lansdowne Crescent, where the geometry of the form itself yields to the irregularities, the topography lines, and it becomes a kind of wiggle rather than a crescent. And it's a kind of amazing thing. It's temple-ish on the end. It's extrudo-temple as it moves around. If you guys ever have to design urban housing in studio, this is a good tip to remember. When you look at this as a figure on its landscape, it seems to be all about this colonnade. But when you see how it actually engages the site, there's this sunken level. And this would have originally been sort of service quarters, that you bring in these slabs of beef, or the kitchen maids go there, or the coal is delivered there. You're able to organize multiple stories. And in fact, there's this like little sunken garden down here in front of the house. And that's a kind of good strategy for making an edge, if you ever have to deal with that. Notice how steeply sloping the lawn is. One thing that's great about that is that you get an incredibly beautiful view toward the river, because the topography helps enhance the view. There's also a ha-ha in place that further articulates the division of the space of Barton Field. These are the backs, kind of ragtag mixture of catch-as-catch-can, lots of different ideas going on here, and quite different from the fronts. In the original scheme, 30 houses, organized with 114 20-foot-tall ionic columns, all facing toward the river, and some of the properties, even at the outset, determined to be rental properties so that tourists coming to take the curative waters at Bath would have a place to stay. This is a cartoon by Thomas Rowlandson showing people running down to take the waters at Bath and having a little bit of difficulty because the slope is so steep. So all of these poor people who need to take the cure just can't quite negotiate the hill. The wheelchairs are running wild. Ha ha ha. Nothing like 18th century humor. You may have noticed that the buildings in the Circus and the Crescent are all built out of the same creamy limestone, which is called Bath stone. The use of the same material throughout the town gives incredible unity to the city. There are a lot of other things that are tightly knitting together the urban fabric, like the cornice heights are kept constant, or the articulation of buildings with a kind of a consistent classical language, at least throughout the major swath of space, from the square to the Circus to the Crescent. The man who owned the quarry of the Bath stone wanted to showcase his beautiful material, and he engaged John Wood the Elder to build him a house. And the house is Prior Park. This is really fabulous Neo-Palladian house. Sir Nicholas Pevsner, one of the great architectural writers of the 20th century, says this is one of the most perfect examples of a Neo-Palladian house in England. And the situation is what we've come to expect from these wonderful romantic gardens with Neo-Palladian houses on top of them. Nice little Palladian bridge here, and so forth. We mentioned before that there was no longer simply one historical style that you could pull from, but there were many historical styles. And you picked your historical style really based on what feelings you wanted to promote. For example, if you wanted to make a church, chances were good that you would now pick a Gothic style, because Gothic was the style of religious architecture that grew up in England. English Gothic, English Christian Gothic architecture, whereas classical architecture has stronger associations with pagan antiquity, and therefore not such a good style for a religious institution. However, if you're making a government building and you want to represent the values of the government, you might make a classical building because you have these great moments of democracy flourishing in Greece or republicanism flourishing in Rome, and to connect, to associate, to conjure up feelings about those societies, you could pick styles. In domestic architecture, it's kind of catch-as-catch-can. Any association is possible. Here we're looking at an early moment in Gothic revival by Horace Walpole, 1749. Horace Walpole is a great patron of the arts. He is a diplomat and spends a lot of time in Italy. He made a grand tour. You have to figure out how to get across the Alps. So Horace Walpole was carried across the Alps in a sedan chair. If you like nature but you don't like hiking, get some of your friends to carry you across the Alps in a sedan chair. This is a sedan chair. In this case, there's a young lady being carried in the sedan chair through London with her plume sticking out. Conveniently, there's a trap door for such occasions. But many tourists were carried through the Alps in sedan chairs. The reason you would go through the Alps instead of taking a ship, which would seem like a more congenial way to get to Italy from England, is that in the sedan chair you would have the experience of the sublime. You would be confronting nature in all of its magnificence, the splendor of the Alps. Of course, you wouldn't be walking, you'd be sitting in the sedan chair, and the people carrying you would be confronting nature in an even more brutal and upright manner. Walpole, for Strawberry Hill, his house on the outskirts of London, picks the style of Gothic revival. And you look at this and you think this is a kind of fake Gothic revival, or let's say it's the look of Gothic revival, but not the structural value of Gothic revival, or even the quality of light and quality of dematerialization that you would expect to get in Gothic revival. We get the Gothic-y wallpaper stuck to the ceiling and then just bearing wall architecture. And this is what it looks like on the exterior, crenellated in a Gothic style, but pretty much punch windows everywhere you go. You know, this is sort of Gothic-y, but not very Gothic-y. It is a rectilinear room with little pointy things imprinted on the surface. And you compare that to real Gothic over here, where we have an architecture that is skeletal, where we have the pointy things deriving from a structural logic of the pointed vault bringing the forces down to the ground. And you can begin to see immediately what a simulacrum of the Gothic something like Strawberry Hill is. But probably Walpole's not so interested in making it Gothic. What he's interested in doing is associating it with the Gothic, conjuring up the feelings, conjuring up the moods that you would have in a Gothic building, but also having a cozy domestic space. The most fabulous and most interesting of all the Gothic revival buildings is Fonthill Abbey for the client William Beckford. William Beckford is an author of Gothic novels, and Gothic novels are these scary novels that have to do with the margin of the normal. They have to do with the paranormal. That have to do with Frankenstein or vampires or scary monsters. Beckford actually wrote Gothic novels, and one of them is called Vathek. The plot of Vathek has to do with this very wealthy, sensually self-indulgent caliph. So already setting it in some exotic part of the world plays well to the idea of the Gothic novel. And what he wants to do is build a house for himself. Or one part of the plot of Vathek is the building of the caliph's mansion. And it is to be a house that engages all the senses. The critique here is that there should be a room where visuality is celebrated, a room where tactility is celebrated, a room that has to do with pleasant smells, a room that has to do with pleasant tastes, a room that has to do with extraordinary surfaces to touch. So that's quite a client. And Beckford's loaded, tons of money. And this is what he builds. But we only have drawings of it because it fell down. And one reason it fell down is that it wasn't constructed well. Beckford wanted it immediately, and he had a lot of money, and he kept telling people, build it really fast, build it really fast. And the builder said, but the foundations need to settle. We need to do this at a certain pace. It can't go any faster. And he said, here's more money. Build it faster. So they built it really fast, and it fell down. And Beckford said, here's more money. Build it faster. And they built it really fast, and it fell down. Beckford eventually gave up. But look at this. I mean, I think this is a kind of amazing example of historical eclecticism. Because we've seen Gothic, we studied Gothic. Look, here's Gothic. This is what Gothic looks like. It doesn't quite look like this. Does anything here look familiar at all? Or could anybody begin to describe what the organization of Fonthill Abbey is? It's an amazing plan. And no answer is wrong. You could look for a form that you recognize, or you can look for a type that you recognize. In fact, I've given you these words. A type, of course, is something familiar like a villa, a basilica, a palazzo. A form is something like a cube, a 4-square grid, a 9-square grid, an oval, a circle. And a model is something that you copy, the thing that you emulate and you try to imitate as directly as possible. So can anybody see anything that's making the different pieces of Fonthill Abbey hang together? Ryan? Good. I'm just going to repeat what you said because I don't think people heard you. He's saying it kind of looks like a Gothic church plan, but the pieces are all over the place. And insofar that as it's fragmented and the pieces are all over the place, certain pieces of it remind you of different things. You kind of see things that look like a tower, which would be over here. You kind of see things that look like a church apse over here. Even in the spindly way that a volume attaches to a linear piece, it kind of looks like the Charlemagne's chapel at Aix-la-Chapelle. I can only remember the French name at the moment. Anybody else have a take on this? Max, your hand is up. It's got a crossing tower. It's got this big cruciform plan and a big tower on top of the cross. This is a weird plan, right? It's sort of like Gothic architecture laid out over Cartesian coordinates. Hyper-rational, Cartesian coordinates, what could be easier? X, Y, and Z. But it's crazy insofar as it breaks apart the kind of syntactical logic of any individual building. Anybody else see anything in here that they can kind of recognize? Because it's kind of a catalog, a kit of parts of things that you might have in the Gothic period. You might have, for example, a castle with these little turrets at the edge. You might have a little cloister with a little refectory at the edge. You might have a cathedral with an apse at the edge. You might have some hulking big processional stairway. So all the pieces that you expect to have in Gothic have been rearranged and recombined and repositioned to create a new whole, and to create a new whole that is familiar but also defamiliarized at the same time because the disjunctions are so radical. So here it looks like, here's what it looks like during that brief great moment before it fell down, and we see here the opening into this huge stairway that looks like a church, but in fact the whole thing is a giant stairway, and whoopsie-daisy, it fell down. But here you can see the thing that looks like the little castellated part over here. This is what the section would have looked like. It would have been the greatest thing in the world. So sad that it fell down. Another figure who was important at the time and also dealt with landscape is Humphrey Repton. And Repton really finds himself at a certain point needing a job and being good at sketching. So he decides to be a consultant for people who want to have these new modernized gardens, these new informal gardens. While Walpole's Strawberry Hill and Wyatt and Beckford's Fonthill Abbey pick Gothic as the one style to use, any style was possible. We saw that in the eclectic assortment of garden pavilions already in the earlier part of the 18th century in gardens like Stourhead and Stowe. Some of his writings provide an insight into what kinds of criteria motivated the decisions about what style to use. This, by the way, is Humphrey Repton, and this is his business card. He shows himself out in the field, surveying. He has a lot of workers here with shovels and wheelbarrows, and they're doing what Humphrey Repton did, which is move heaven and earth to make the view more agreeable. And by heaven and earth, I mean move trees, transplant fully grown trees, make a lake, bring in a village, add elements to the landscape to take away its barrenness and to increase the picturesque qualities. This image, I think, is telling. It shows us a distant tower. And one thing that Repton did, because Repton's projects were often of a smaller scale than the kinds of extremely grand projects that other landscape architects like Bridgman and Kent dealt with. Because Repton's projects were a smaller scale, he often had to borrow vistas. So he would cut swaths of space through to collect views together. But Repton's real genius had to do with how he promoted his projects. Because unlike, say, Capability Brown, who had a large contracting company and was able not simply to suggest design proposals, but also to execute design proposals, Repton operated simply as a consultant, but he was able to convince clients of his ideas by presenting them with these red books. They're called red books because, well, here's the cover. Look what color it is. It's red. And the red books are just flip books. Like you see something that looks like this, and you say, well, this looks kind of good. I don't know if you can see this little line here. But what you do in the red books is you see the unimproved version, and then you flip something over, and you see the improved version. This is unimproved, and this is improved, I think. I'm thinking that. I don't know. I don't have as good taste as Humphrey Repton. The improved version tends to shy away from single trees and instead favor clumping of trees, things in threes and so forth. The improved version tends to favor view lines, vistas, rather than axes to organize your space. I'm quite sure that this is the improved version, where here you have this little straggly stream, and you flip over the little flap, like in a children's book, and suddenly you see what could happen if only Mr. Humphrey Repton could get the commission to consult on your garden. well, this is fine. This is a nice meadow, but it's a bit thin. It's a bit bare. What if we were to plant an edge of trees and put a little temple there? What if we got some more cattle so that we had more staffage in the picture? And what if we really cleared out a view toward this church in the distance? These are some machines that Repton might have used. These are devices for transplanting fully grown trees, because Repton couldn't wait 50 years for the landscape to come into its full glory. It was much more agreeable to have the landscape ready to go on day one. Some of the terms that Repton uses in his discussion of architecture are character. And what are the qualities of the house? What's its character? What associations do you get by looking at this house? How does it make you feel? How does it work with its landscape? What landscape would be appropriate? What kind of vistas can you command? Large organized views. And what kinds of agreeable elements can be added to increase the picturesque value of the whole? You always know you want to have some cattle or sheep, or a nice little bridge in the foreground. This is another one of the red books with the before and the after qualities revealed to you. Here Repton has provided a lake to break up the monotony of the meadow and given us some little eye-catching elements like a little bridge to arrest the movement of our eye as we move through the landscape. Repton makes all kinds of suggestions about associationism, associating one kind of style with one kind of feeling, and plays up these strong emotions. Here he's saying time will get you. But here he's also saying all these houses in some way are variations on the same theme. Here in the background on the far side of this picturesque lake, we see a series of different architectural styles. A castle on a hill, a Gothic house down by the water's edge, some kind of fortified house up on a hill, a classical house, and here it almost looks like the house has some kind of mobile dome on it, which would not be surprising, because part of the character, or part of this embrace of history, at least on the part of the English, has to do with making quotations from various parts of the vast English Empire, which was at its height in the 19th century. Grecian, very agreeable. Gothic, craggy terrain, overgrown forest, dark sky, domesticated animals, wild animals. I think this is probably the most telling of Repton's plates. This is from a different book he did called Character of Houses. Throughout his consulting, and Repton consulted on more than 400 projects, including the house of Jane Austen's mother, he would often make suggestions about changing the facade, making the appearance of the house more sympathetic with the landscape that the house was situated in. And you can see that here, A, B, C, D, E, F, plan, but the style can be made to very easily translate from one to the other to the other. So it's an incredibly modern sensibility, an incredibly eclectic sensibility. And in the expansion of possibilities to all of history, meaning is beginning to slip away, and people are becoming fairly desperate. More about that and the modern